How the occupation of Palestine helped build the perfect techno-military complex. A new book says Israel's experience in controlling and surveilling a population has allowed it to export its combat hardware and knowledge to almost every corner of the planet. We'll speak to Antony Loewenstein about the Palestine laboratory. Plus, is Benjamin Netanyahu getting closer to passing his controversial judicial reforms? With a budget now in place, can political maneuvering stop the will of protesters? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Israel. Most of us alive today are younger than the Israel-Palestine conflict. It started after World War II and has taken different forms since, but for 56 years, Israel has occupied the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. And according to research by investigative journalist Antony Loewenstein, Israel has been able to capitalize on that experience by selling the weapons and technology that it's tested during occupation. In his new book, The Palestine Laboratory, Loewenstein also details how the Israeli Defense Forces have been paid to train even sanctioned militaries around the world for profit.
How Israel has exported the occupation and why it's such an attractive model are examined in ways that frame the Jewish state as one of the most influential nations on the planet. The chapters that follow don't just detail the many countries where Israeli tools and tracking have reduced democratic possibilities, but reveal a campaign to increase and influence similarly minded ethno-nationalist entities.
And investigative journalist, filmmaker, and author Antony Loewenstein joins me now from Sydney. Thanks so much for being with us. Okay, give me the crux of what you wanted to expose in writing this book and why calling it the Palestine Laboratory was appropriate.
You know, one of the ideas behind the book was that Israel has been running an occupation for now 56 years and counting. The West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. It's one of the longest occupations in modern times. And the way that Israel's done that for so long is using a range of tools and technologies to do so, and everything from smart walls to intelligence to spyware, a range of other tools. And increasingly in the last years, although for decades, but it's increased since 9/11, so many nations have also wanted those kinds of tools and technologies in their own states to repress their own people. And when Israel promotes and sells those, it says that they're battle tested. So it's been tested in the West Bank, Gaza, or East Jerusalem. So that's kind of how this Palestine laboratory actually works.
Right. So you talk a lot about the complicity, intentional or otherwise, of other nations. Who was actually the worst offender that you discovered in all of this research?
I mean, there are so many. I mean, everything from, I think viewers should be aware that my research showed that roughly 130 countries, so the majority of countries in the world, have bought some form of Israeli defense or spyware or defense technology. And we're talking about democracies and dictatorships. I mean, everything from Rwanda, literally during the genocide in 1994, Myanmar in the last years when they were literally committing genocide against the Rohingya people. During apartheid South African era, Israel was very, very close to that country, both in terms of defense, but also ideologically. I think they shared a belief about, in South Africa's case, white supremacy, and in Israel's case, a belief that Jews have the right to dominate over Palestinians. There are so many other examples. And I think one of the things that really comes out so strongly for me in the research of the book is that there are very few countries that Israel won't sell to. As far as we're aware, North Korea, Syria, Iran, although Israel did sell a lot to Iran before 1979's revolution in Iran, to the dictatorship there. So in some ways, I think I see Israeli defense sales almost as an insurance policy, that there are some in Israel who realize that what's happening there is not liked by a lot of the world, the occupation of Palestine. But if you sell so much defense technology and spyware and various other tools to those countries, Israel believes that you're likely to insulate yourself from any potential political headwinds that might come against you. And in the short to medium term, I think they're probably right.
Right. I mean, Israel is pretty aware you seem to describe it, of the complicity of these other nations who buy their weapons and employ, Israel as a military consultant. And they also know that that helps make Israel, in a sense, untouchable in all of this, because everyone is now involved.
Everyone's involved. And I mean, one of the key words in some ways, if one has to summarize it, is impunity. I mean, Israel is essentially untouchable. And what I mean by that is that the main country, of course, that protects Israel is the US. And it's clear that the US remains the world's biggest arms dealer by far. About 40% of the world's arms deals are conducted by the US. Israel is now 10th, which is pretty remarkable for a tiny country. And other countries obviously have also battle-tested weapons. The US did that in Iraq and Afghanistan. The West is doing that currently in Ukraine. But Israel has a permanently occupied population literally next door in Palestine for decades, indefinitely. And the complicity in some ways is not just other nations that are working with Israel to protect it diplomatically or militarily, but also because they're desperate for that kind of technology, the spyware, the smart walls, the biometric tools. And as I said, much of that is initially tested on Palestinians in Palestine.
And it's ironic, too, that Israel has been able to make itself almost an ideological model for other nations, even if those nations are arguably anti-Semitic. It's this model that you think Israel has built that other certain nations kind of aspire to at this point.
I mean, this is one of the, to me, deep shames. And I say this as someone who's Jewish, not religious, but Jewish. And Israel, I think, in some ways is really inarguably the world's leading ethno-nationalist state, meaning a nation that proudly benefits Jews over anybody else. And in the last decades, you see a lot of alliances that Israel is forming, often with nations that are deeply anti-Semitic, their leaders are anti-Semitic. You see nations that are increasingly ideologically aligned with Israel, such as India. Now, India traditionally has been much more supportive of Palestine, but in the last sort of 10 years or so under Prime Minister Modi, a man who is committed to building a Hindu fundamentalist state, there are literally pogroms against Muslims across India. And what India is doing in Kashmir in some ways is very reminiscent of what Israel's doing in the West Bank. And in fact, Indian officials have openly said that they admire what Israel's doing. So I'm not claiming in the book that India is doing this because of Israel, not at all. But they're inspired by it. And in fact, more than that, they often have a lot of defense sales and there's training between those countries. So, and also finally, it's pretty disturbing when you go often to far-right rallies. These are groups that are traditionally anti-Semitic, neo-Nazis in the US, in Europe. Often they're waving the Israeli flag. Now, initially that might seem crazy. How is this possible? Groups that don't like Jews. But actually there's an affinity there. They don't like Jews at all. But what they like is what Israel is doing as an ethno-nationalist state, because they themselves want to create often a Christian ethno-nationalist state in their own nation, in Europe or the US, wherever it may be. So those kinds of alliances, which I might add Israel often supports, encourages, deepens, is not just dangerous, but also endangers, frankly, a lot of Jews around the world, including me and many other citizens as well.
Amazing. Antony, you were already aware of how Israel has been able to monetize its military and its combat experience outside of Israel across the entire world. But did anything actually surprise even you in your research about how the entire complex works?
I think the extent of it, the sheer massive extent of it, how many nations, and also when nations were known to be committing not just human rights abuses, but potentially genocide, it didn't stop Israel selling weapons. Now, again, the US has a long history of doing very similar things. That's true in the past and today. But Israel holds itself up and claims to be a light unto the nations, a democracy, a beacon of hope in the Middle East. And apart from the fact that's complete nonsense unless you're Jewish, because, of course, it discriminates actively against non-Jews, Palestinians and others. But I think the shock to me was finding the depth of it. And also, in some ways, I think the personal impact of people who are affected by these sales. So I spoke to a lot of people, for example, who had their privacy breached by Israeli spyware. Now, these people weren't killed, but they had their entire lives upended. They were journalists, for example, who had their sources discovered by, say, a Mexican government or the Togolese government or a range of other regimes. They were individuals whose husbands were killed in the Mexican drug war, and they themselves then were spied on. People felt completely naked because they had, their entire lives upended. Or people, of course, whose countries were destroyed by Israeli drones, which of course have become ubiquitous. So it's their personal impact also really hit me.
The extent of it, I mean, it's hard to describe listening to what you're saying. It seems to reach even the furthest corners of the world. Is there any country in particular, though, that you feel was kind of most morally compromised in its dealings with Israel on this level?
The nation, I think, and I spend quite a lot of the book talking about this, is South Africa. Now, obviously, apartheid South Africa regime ended in 1994, so it's history, but actually I think it's deeply relevant today. Let me just briefly explain. So the countries both, as I said, had defence relationships. They were very close to each other for the entire history of apartheid South Africa. But there was an ideological component there, and I think that's important because how Israel saw itself is very much modelled on what South Africa was doing to blacks in those townships, those so-called Bantustans. And to some extent, those Bantustans still exist in parts of South Africa, sadly, even after the end of apartheid. But a lot of Israeli leaders looked to what South Africa was doing, and they said, we want to do something similar to Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, where there were then settlements. And I think that's important because South African apartheid now is seen as a pariah state. Who would say openly they supported apartheid South Africa? Israel supported it right till the end. When the entire world had finally turned against it in the 1990s, Israel was there. And that's relevant today in 2023 because what Israel is doing now, although it's not exactly the same, it's remarkably similar to what apartheid South Africa was doing. But unlike apartheid South Africa, which wasn't as good as doing this, Israel has monetized and exported the occupation. And so the occupation itself is not just in Palestine. It's obviously there and it's horrendous. But it's now exported around the world to literally over 100 countries. And that, to me, is the kind of the moral collapse that I see within the Israeli state. And the Jewish diaspora, by the way, that often supports it.
Okay. So final question for you. I mean, is any of this reversible? Or is this relationship with the occupation of Palestinian territories and basically Israel's military-industrial complex now just institutionalized and here to stay?
It's institutionalized within Israel. I think internally the chances of any being serious kind of resistance or revolt is minuscule. Like apartheid South Africa didn't end because of white South Africans waking up. It ended because of massive economic sanctions and pressure. That, to me, really is the key here, that there needs to be both a global understanding of what's going on. I think there should be economic sanctions, but also just, for example, in a maybe simpler way, banning spyware. The European Union at the moment is currently flirting with the idea of banning Israeli spyware, much of which is based in Europe. Spyware is ubiquitous, it's growing, it's everywhere. It's not just Pegasus, which is the most infamous, but many other companies. So what could be done today is to ban that technology, to at least regulate it. I mean, that would be a vital first step.
Okay.
Because the problem and the challenge is that many nations don't want to give up the right to use that spyware on their own citizens. But that, to me, is something that's possible. And I think there are people in the EU particularly which are pushing for it.
Okay, Antony Loewenstein, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us on The Newsmakers. So while the Israel-Palestine conflict approaches its 6th decade, Israel is also dealing with its own pressing internal issues. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu secured a 2-year Israeli national budget on Wednesday and suggested it could clear the way for a resumption of his coalition's contested judicial overhaul. The introduction of those reforms in January set off months of unprecedented anti-government demonstrations. Under pressure at home and abroad, Netanyahu suspended the plans, but when asked by a journalist if he would try again, this was his response.
Certainly, but we are trying to reach understandings. I hope we will succeed in that.
Well, Netanyahu's relaxed attitude does not reflect the feeling on the streets of Israel, where 4 months of protests over his proposed reforms further stressed an already troubled economy. Still, Netanyahu's government managed to pass a new 2-year budget that's drawn criticism even from his own budget division. Not only does the new spending plan increase funding to ultra-Orthodox Jewish schools and seminary students, the opposition says it will encourage unemployment and harm growth.
While you were sleeping, the worst and most destructive budget in the country's history was passed. There is no good news in it. There is no struggle with the cost of living. There is only endless extortion. This budget is the violation of the contract with the citizens of Israel, which all of us and our children and our children's children will still pay for.
To debate where Israel is going now are from West Jerusalem, Mitchell Barak. He served as an aide to Benjamin Netanyahu and speechwriter for former Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. And also from West Jerusalem is Jeremy Saltan, former Knesset faction director of the Yamina party. Thanks both so much for being with me. Mitchell, let me first get your take on what's happened more recently here. And opposition leader Yair Lapid says this is the worst, most destructive budget in Israel's history that's now been passed, and it actually brings Netanyahu a step closer to overhauling the judiciary the way he wants. How did that happen, and can it be stopped?
Well, this is typical Netanyahu. Netanyahu, you know, I'll quote Ariel Sharon. Ariel Sharon was chairman of the Likud, then became prime minister. And when he was chairman of the Likud, before he became prime minister, he was once speaking to the Likud Central Committee. And he said, you know, Benjamin Netanyahu offered to help me, and I'm very grateful for his help. But I don't know, is Bibi helping me with his right hand or his left hand? And everyone laughed because everyone knew what that meant. And that's Bibi Netanyahu. As finance minister, he would have been attacking this as the worst budget ever, as horrible for a free market economy, horrible for investment, horrible incentivizing, non-incentivizing ultra-religious people to work, giving out grants to people that don't necessarily deserve it for political reasons. That was Netanyahu as finance minister 10 years ago. Netanyahu as prime minister, he's doing whatever he can to save his ship. So he's giving away the store, and it is possibly the worst budget ever. And he's just bought people off. It's a Machiavellian budget. Here's what he needs to do in order to stay in power, and that's what he's doing. Okay.
Jeremy, worst budget ever, or is Netanyahu just a master politician that gets what needs to be done?
I mean, I think Mitchell would at least agree with me that the budgets that led to the financial crisis in the mid-'80s were obviously a lot worse than this particular budget. To say it was the worst of all time is a little bit going a bit too far there. Yes, we know that Netanyahu, whether you like him or you don't like him, he has staying power, and there's a reason why he was able to go ahead and pull off this budget. I mean, I think that if you look at most politicians, it would be very difficult for them to be able to get a budget like this passed with every single member of his coalition actually voting for. And of course, I'll give credit to the opposition, where we see that every member of the opposition voted against this budget. So you can definitely give them credit there as well. But again, you know, this is not the worst budget of all time.
Okay, but let's. I want to be more specific though about.
Okay, I'll give that.
But I want to go to the implications
is
of
at an all-time low in 4 years.
Other than that, though,
and the economy is crashing and investment is down.
But
it's not the worst budget ever.
We immediately associate the budget
involved
with its economic impact. I'm really actually talking about the implications for the reforms he wants to go forward. You know, we've seen historic protests, Mitchell, in Israel, and this budget is actually counter to what all those protesters were calling and fighting for. Have those protests then had any effect on what Netanyahu wants and will still try to get, as he's very clearly said he's still after?
Well, I don't think the protests were connected to the budget per se. It's fair to say that all of the people protesting find this budget to be grotesque, offensive, and bad for the country as a whole, because it's political, it's pork barrel politics is what it is. And, you know, even giving to the ultra-Orthodox pork is not the greatest thing. So that's what I would say, you know, is the problem. They're more talking about the reforms, which are somewhat supposed to be put on hold. Of course, it's still tabled in the Knesset, so Netanyahu can, you know, call back the judicial reform at any minute and slam it through. And there is, you know, a fear that he will try and do that. That's really what the protests are about. It doesn't help. Netanyahu doesn't look like someone who's trying to lead the whole country. He looks like he's trying to lead, you know, the majority of 64, which was elected, without really caring what the other side wants, either from a judicial reform side or from an economic side or from, you know, a unity side. Now, most of the people who are protesting are the people who are in high tech, are the people, they're not learning in yeshiva, they're working. And this is something that has already hurt these people. I mean, just the shekel being devalued, you know, now at a 4-year low is horrible for exports and horrible for investments. I mean, I know people who, you know, have venture capital funds, and people have taken money out of it because they don't like the way the country is going when it comes to this judicial reform.
You know, Jeremy, I asked actually last time if Netanyahu could just kind of wait this out, hope that the protests lose their momentum and then push at least some of his reforms through. It seems like that's actually exactly what he's doing. Do you think it's going to work, or will Israel just be brought to a halt again?
Well, I think we're going to figure out what happens over the course of the next couple months. The current Knesset session lasts until the end of July. There are a few important dates now that we've passed the budget. Probably the most important of such is the June 15th deadline for choosing the Knesset members on the judicial panel that chooses judges. So we'll see what happens there. But at least right now, both the coalition and the opposition are sitting in secret talks under the auspice of the president of the state of Israel. And right now, at least, it would seem that there is a chance that something can be done at least before June 15th. It's very possible that we'll see one of the sides blow it up before that time. But I don't expect anything over the next couple of weeks. I do think that that will be an important date. And then afterwards, we'll have to see what happens as we get close to the end of the Knesset session. Because if he wants to move anything through, he has a limited amount of time in which he can go ahead and do that. Let's remind the viewers that the Knesset goes off for a long 3-month vacation where you don't pass legislation at the end of July. So if he's not able to go ahead and pass something by the end of July when they go into recess, he's going to have a very big issue with a lot of his coalition partners on the right.
Mitchell, is there a chance something can happen before June 15th?
Well, always another war will put Israelis together and put everything on hold like we had recently. Unfortunately, it usually takes some kind of tragedy or some kind of danger to unite Israelis and put this on the back burner. I mean, I think that part of Netanyahu definitely realizes that this is not where he wants to be. And this is not the legacy that he's wants to leave. Meaning, you know, he's undoing. There was just a New York Times article, you know, that said he's basically undoing his entire economic legacy, which was so strong. You know, as someone who's credited for really making the economy strong and bringing the high tech to the forefront and investment and making this country the startup nation that it is, he's just damaging a lot of that. You know, damaging a lot of it, incentivizing people not to work, giving away, you know, things for politics. He doesn't look good. I mean, he can't, you know, when you have to survive. So he doesn't have any real policy that he's trying to promote. And his legacy really looks like it's going downhill. So he's got to be concerned with that. He doesn't want to leave now as prime minister.
I mean, Jeremy,
if this is going to be his last term.
Jeremy, I don't see you disagreeing. And, you know, National Unity Chairman Benny Gantz says that Netanyahu is actually drunk with power right now. I mean, might Netanyahu be slightly, I don't know if delusional is the word, if he thinks he can just play it this way, you know, undo his legacy, as Mitchell puts it?
I don't think we're going to be talking about Netanyahu's legacy for some time. A biannual budget was just passed. That means 2 more years at least for this government. That means we're looking till, let's say, until June of 2025 being the earliest possible time in which we would see a election, if called early, unless we would see one of the coalition partners jump with the opposition to actually vote for the dissolution of this government. So I think, again, that'll be a conversation that we might be having in a few more years, or at least a couple of them.
Mitchell, as far as the judicial reform is concerned, because I asked, earlier if Israel could be brought to a halt again, if, very unpopular reforms are kind of forced through. There were supposed to be those negotiations, but it seems there is still no middle ground being found here. Have all these negotiations failed? And then again, could Israel potentially be facing another election sometime if this kind of deadlock over those specific reforms remains?
Well, we always have a vibrant democracy here, and there always can be elections. It is correct that Jeremy said the next date is really, they've passed a 2-year budget, which is great. And that's one of Netanyahu's legacies. I think he instituted that 2-year budget because he didn't want to go through this process every year on December 31st. The problem is this is the same Netanyahu, the right hand, just passed a 2-year budget and made sure that the Knesset has a 2-year budget. But during Corona and for the first 2 Knesset elections of the 5, we had no budget. I work with municipalities. They had no budget to do anything. So he doesn't care that much about a budget, to make sure that Israel has a budget when it serves him politically not to have it. So, yes, there's no structural threat to the government, which if they don't pass the budget, the government falls. But, he's got to placate a lot of very different and unruly coalition partners who, if you can see from the budget negotiations, some of them are really, really greedy. They're really, really greedy, and they have no shame. There's no shame to what they can ask for. And I'm talking specifically about the ultra-Orthodox parties. They kept raising the stakes of what they wanted and threatening. And also from Ben Gvir and Smotrich's party, they just keep getting greedy and more greedy. And, at some point, Netanyahu really doesn't want this government. He talks about a right-wing government. He doesn't want it. He would like to cut those guys that are really to the right of him and bring in some more normal people. But he can't because he's burned those bridges. He's done that before, and he burned those bridges. And those people will not have anything to do with him. So he's limited in his options, but he doesn't like where he is now because this is not a governing coalition.
Jeremy, I don't see you disagreeing. Just quick final thoughts.
Look, I'm sure that Netanyahu would like to have different coalition partners, and like Mitchell said, those partners aren't exactly coming. Look, I've served, perhaps uniquely so, in coalitions with everyone from Ra'am and Mansour Abbas all the way to the Otzma party over my many years in Knesset. And I'll tell you that every single party goes ahead and has their coalition demands. I don't think that's something that's unique to the ultra-Orthodox. I think it's fair to say that if you do look at Netanyahu's record as finance minister, or in specifically the governments which he led or was a part of, where the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, were not part of the coalition, he went ahead and definitely was not afraid to make cuts there. But I'm saying just the same, he's able to make a deal with whoever he needs to in order to stay in power. That's the story of his career, and that's why he's been prime minister for, what is it now, over 15 years collectively.
Indeed. Jeremy Saltan, that will have to be the final word. I'd like to thank you and Mitchell Barak for joining us on this edition of The Newsmakers, and our viewers, of course, for being with us as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.